This video is going to be about Zenithal Priming and the reasons why you should be Zenithal Priming and the reasons why you shouldn't. Zenithal Priming is a technique where you use either rattle cans or an airbrush to achieve a sense of light on your miniature. It's the first thing you do after you've assembled it, and most commonly you use first a black to coat the entire miniature and then dust lightly with a brighter color, most typically a white, from up top and at a 45-degree angle. The result is that the miniature looks like it's been lit by an imaginary sky, because all that white paint just sticks to the bits that are sort of facing upwards. And that's why it's called Zenithal Priming. When the sun is straight sort of above your head, it's called a zenith. The sun's in a zenith, and hence Zenithal Priming. I myself started Zenithal Priming when I started painting miniatures. I started Zenithal Priming miniatures because I saw everyone else do it. You know, it's sort of a thing. And of course, everyone is after this thing that will automatically make your miniature look better. Like everyone wants the goose that pops out golden eggs. It's easy to see why we Zenithal Prime, because immediately the miniature looks like really cool, even before you've started to paint it. But what are you actually going to do with this sort of statuesque, grey-looking mini? So if you sort of paint miniatures, I'm going to say in the traditional manner, where you sort of, well, let's say you have your Zenithal Prime, and then you put another coat of paint on there, like say a blue, and you do it twice because you want sort of nice coverage, and then you put a blue wash on there, and then you sort of put a lighter blue on there, and then you sort of maybe you dry brush it to make it pop, or maybe you're sort of edge highlighting, and you know what you've done is you've added enough layers of paint that the Zenithal Priming is pretty much pointless. So if this is sort of the way you like to paint, which is, you know, most commonly the typical way of painting, how are you going to be using that Zenithal Priming? You can still use it as a guide, a luminosity guide. I know it's a fancy word, but basically a guide for what's supposed to be light on your miniature and what's supposed to be dark. And for me personally, this is actually what I struggle most with on miniatures, because I sort of get carried away with painting the one color, and all of a sudden I've got this sort of uniform shade all over my miniature, where it should have been darker under the arms, maybe, in all these things that you so obviously see once you've Zenithal primed a miniature, but I've sort of just painted over it and forgotten about it on the way. So I'm going to paint a mini sort of in a traditional manner. I mean, I'm going to cover up all the Zenithal Priming, but I'm going to use my Zenithal Priming as a guide. Now, when I Zenithal Prime, I usually use a black, and I actually, instead of a white, I tend to use a light grey. I've made a video about why I like using a light grey. This is Grey Seer from Citadel. You can check the video out if you wish. There's a comparison between Corax White and Grey Seer. But, you know, we don't have to be brand specific either. It might as well be Army Painter Black and a light grey from Vallejo. Anyway, back to the miniature I painted. What I did was I took pictures of the Zenithal primed miniature. I bumped up the contrast and made them black and white, so sort of to exaggerate the Zenithal priming. And then I actually printed them out, which gave me something that looks like this. Printing it out is not necessary. I just enjoy not having to look at my phone while I paint. And this is going to be my sort of luminosity guide. This miniature, by the way, if you don't recognize it or know it, it's a Castigator, a Stormcast Eternal from Games Workshop. I really like this sculpt. Now, while painting this mini, I really tried to exaggerate sort of the light. If it's going to be dark, it's going to be black. So I use different techniques. I used wet blending, stippling, layer painting, edge highlighting. anything to try and just follow the light from, my roadmap. Now, just to exaggerate this whole sort of luminosity thing, I really wanted my darkest places on the miniature to be black. So I sort of blended all my colors with the black. If it's a green, I sort of blended it with the black to make it darker. This is more of a style thing. It could be really nice to, if you're painting a green, then maybe blend in a darker blue for the shadows to get different tones going. It usually looks really nice. But I wanted this sort of really heavy, dark looking miniature. And while I was working, I was sort of constantly checking my printed out little roadmap of light and just trying to follow it sort of religiously. I didn't use any washes or contrast paints. I only used sort of regular opaque paints. And the only place where I sort of stepped off my roadmap was the on the weapon. I wanted sort of a glow coming from whatever it is they've got up there that they shoot and explodes and causes havoc on the battlefield. And because my Zenithal Priming wasn't really glowing up there in the weapon, I just sort of freebased some glow. For the sake of exaggerating the blacks, and also because I wanted sort of this sort of grimy, a bit war-torn crossbow fella, I used some oil paints and pigments as well in the end when I finished with all the regular paints. I've done a video introducing sort of oil paints and pigments if you're interested. And this is what the finished sort of ultra matte varnished miniature looked like. Now, I put a lot of effort into painting this miniature just for the fun of it. But having this Zenithal guide, it really helped. And I've actually never sort of religiously followed a piece of paper like this before. Like usually I might have Zenithal primed and then I just sort of try and remember where things are supposed to be bright and things are supposed to be dark. But I realized doing it this way, I could sort of double check. And you might be wondering sort of what the difference is between sort of just painting your miniature and slabbing some wash on there and then sort of raising up the highlights of all the raised bits and pieces compared to, because the results can be similar, yes? Well, apart from the fact that this miniature took quite some time to paint, personally, I get the feeling that the sort of sense of light on this miniature is more natural than what I usually get. It's sort of purposely dark, but it's more natural looking. Like the gradients are sort of nicer and they're in the right places. And even though it's sort of, obviously it should be darker under the arms, but what happens sort of further down? And the fact that the bottom half of the miniature is sort of darker than the upper half, these are things that I usually sort of forget about on the way. Now let's have a look at another Castigator that I've Zenithal primed, and another technique that you can use if you've Zenithal primed your miniature. Now this technique the purpose of this is to paint with paints that let the Zenithal priming shine through. So that means either sort of thin layers of opaque regular paints or using paints that are transparent, like a wash or an ink or a contrast paint. So the first step here is to exaggerate the luminosity. It's the fancy word again. And so what you want to do is sort of brighten up some of the highlights that you really think should be brighter and maybe darken down some pieces of the miniature. So I basically did a light dry brush here and there, and even sort of edge highlighted some bits and pieces that I thought should be popping, like the face and the shoulder pads and stuff like that. And then I used a watered down black in some of the places that I felt that, they should be more shaded. The whole purpose of this painting procedure is that you will be seeing the Zenithal priming. So the Zenithal priming itself is fairly important. Now, when you use rattle cans, this is kind of difficult to control. You can obviously use less white, but it's still sort of wherever it ends up is sort of a bit more non-specific. Now, if you're using an airbrush, because I haven't got one, but if you do, then you can be a lot more sort of specific and sort of really making something a bit more dramatic. And so first off, I'm going to use a regular opaque, just a regular paint. It's a blue for the armor. I water it down a little bit with water, and then it's beneficiary to add some kind of flow improver. There's lots of different flow improvers. You're going to have to Google it. I used contrast medium because that's what I had lying around. The flow improver will make the paint sort of flow out on the surface of the miniature just a little bit better. And then I basically just slapped this on all the armored bits, and sort of wherever I wanted a little bit more highlights, I tried to wipe some off. Like I dipped my brush in a bit of water and cleaned it off and just tried to sort of wipe some of the paint off, so that sort of in the face and the shoulder pads, I got a feeling of more highlights. And then I did exactly the same thing with the cloak, just using red. Now, as you can see, the result is kind of pale, and I like the way it looks on the armor, but the cloak is, it's a little bit boring. So I slapped on a wash, a red wash, just to make it a little bit darker in the recesses, but also just adding some saturation. And for the weapon, I'm going for the same sort of glow vibe that I got on the other miniature, and so I used a contrast paint for this. On the rest of the weapon, just to show what just a wash will do, I used a Reichland flesh shade on some parts, sort of to mimic some kind of warm metal, and Nuln Oil on the rest. And then I realized I wanted, the golden parts, or the warm metal bits, I wanted them to be more golden. So I actually had some yellow ink that I mixed into the Reichland flesh shade. And inks are usually very saturated, and you should probably be watering them down when you use them. So I watered my ink down, and then I mixed it with the flesh shade. Now what you can see in the background here that I've been doing is that I've been adding these paints to my wet palette. And that's mainly just because it was the fastest way of working. But sort of inks and contrast paints and washes, they have a tendency to seep through the paper in the wet palette and start making a mess. And also something like a contrast paint, they say it should be in the bottle and shaken every now and again to sort of retain its properties. So in theory, you shouldn't be putting these things in your wet palette. Anyway, I sort of wanted the cloak to be even more saturated, as in having more color. And if I would have had like a red or a pink, maybe ink, would have been nice, but I don't. So I used the same ink mixture as on the weapon, which sort of gave it a bit more of a brown kind of a look, but it's still, I'm fine with that. And as a final step, I did some very fast edge highlights with just regular opaque paints, like some really light blue on the armor and a bit of pink on the cloak. For the base, I mainly used just washes and a dry brush, and then just a little bit of pigment just to, be a bit fancy. Now, after a super matte varnish, this is sort of what it looks like. And by the way, I know I'm pointing my finger a lot in this video, but I've got a, if you're wondering how I got this varnish going, there's a video, of course, about that as well. Now, mind you, I painted this really fast. This was the opposite of the other miniature. And I didn't really do that. There's no real thought process behind it, only that I sort of naturally found that painting in this manner could be done, you could get kind of nice results really fast. But that doesn't say that you couldn't spend your time on this as well. But sort of the immediate first sort of downside I could see using this technique is it's a bit tricky when you mess up. Like if you get paint in the wrong places, it's kind of difficult to fix. It's fixable, but it takes time to fix it because you basically have to sort of repaint the Zenithal priming that was there. So, you have to be kind of careful when you're putting the paint on. Now, these two minis aren't really comparable because I spent ages on one of them, and the other one I did really fast. And there's no real point to that. You could probably use either technique, fast or slow. But I think that the previous technique of sort of using glazes has more potential of being a fast technique. Now this last sort of technique of using sort of see-through or transparent paints on zenithal priming is something I very much enjoy on terrain. I usually sort of mix opaque paint with a lot of water and maybe a bit of flow improver and just sort of smear on, you know, a red earth or a yellow brick or a, you know, grey stones or whatever. And then with sort of a wash on that and maybe a bit of dry brush. And it's a very sort of fast, good looking way of working with terrain. So we've had sort of using zenithal priming as a guide to your luminosity. Also just using it as, you know, actually so that you can see it through the other paint. What else can you do with zenithal priming? Well, one way is obviously changing out the paint. Like, it doesn't have to be a black and a white. Say, hypothetically, if you want to really quickly get some ultramarines on the table, you could spray paint it with sort of a darker blue and then dust it with a lighter blue and then just paint up some of the details. And relatively fast, you can probably get a lot of ultramarines together. Did you know, by the way, that ultramarine is actually the name of a pigment, a blue pigment? You can also use metallics. Pointy finger again. I recently did a video about using metallic zenithal priming as the base for painting some robots, and then working sort of in the similar way of using transparent paint to paint some of the details, but otherwise a pretty efficient way of getting some now outdated Necrons. I know there's new Necrons out on the table, or any other droid. I'm hoping by now you're starting to get an idea of that there should be a reason to why you are zenithal priming. And if you've been watching all of this and you've been like not impressed, you know, then, and you have been zenithal priming, then maybe you should rethink and just use the one layer of rattle can or, you know, prime with an airbrush and just paint without considering the zenithal priming. There's no shame in not zenithal priming. Like, it should be a tool that you like to use if you find it, you know that it helps you paint. It's not something that you need to do to get a nice painted Mini. This is, after all, a hobby. We're supposed to be having fun, and, you know, it's supposed to be relaxing and all of this. So, I mean, even just the fact that you like to zenithal prime because you like the look of it and then you smudge paint all over it afterwards anyway, that's fine as well. Everything is allowed. I'm just trying to sort of, you know, help out, maybe utilize the reason why you should be zenithal priming. Now, I would really love to hear how you use zenithal priming, because I'm sure I've missed the most important and obvious fact, as always. But it would, anyway, it would be interesting to hear how you use zenithal priming. So please write comments about that. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the content on this channel and want to support, there is a Patreon where you can, you know, at the moment not really get all that much. I'm still working on that bit. For now, I've set up sort of a Discord channel that you can access via Patreon, and, you know, come with suggestions for videos or requests for things, and, you know, you might even get to ask me what to paint and I might do it, who knows. But you're more than welcome. If you feel that, you know, you haven't got any money to spend, then you can at least help me sort of try and spread the word about the channel, which is always helpful. Please, I don't say this very often, you know, please like, subscribe. And if you subscribe, please hit the notifications button. I have sort of people going, oh, you're back from your break. And that was like in November. Yeah, anyway. Thanks for watching. Bye.